You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 291 of the Meet the Farmers podcast. I am your host, Ben Eagle, and today on the show, we're talking about paludiculture. You might not have heard of it, but paludiculture is the practice of wetland farming. Essentially growing crops on rewetted lands, usually peatlands. And paludiculture is emerging as a way to restore peatlands and reduce carbon emissions, but it's also exploring the creation of new income opportunities for farmers and landowners who face wet conditions. Peatlands, as many of you know, play a critical role in our natural environment. They store vast amounts of carbon, support biodiversity, and regulate water levels. However, draining peatlands releases huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. But the big question is, can we farm in a way that both protects and restores these landscapes? And could paludiculture provide some of the answers? To help us understand more, I'm joined today by two guests from the Wildlife Trust for Lancashire, Manchester and North Merseyside, Jenny Bennion, who is Senior Communications Officer, and Sarah Johnson, who is Head of Peatland Landscape Recovery. Sarah and Jenny, welcome to the show. Can you introduce yourselves, please?
Yeah, so hi, my name's Jenny. As Ben said, I'm one of the communication officers at the Wildlife Trust for Lancashire, Manchester and North Merseyside. One of the things that I do as part of my day-to-day role is trying to kind of tell people about the work we're doing around paludiculture, or sometimes we call it wet farming, and just kind of getting that story out there, answering people's questions and things like that.
Fantastic. Sarah?
Yeah, hi, my name is Sarah Johnson and I'm Head of Peatland Nature Recovery for Lancashire Wildlife Trust. So I've been involved with peatlands for a long time, but Lancashire Wildlife Trust for about 5 years. And we do sort of a lot of the what I call conventional peatland restoration, but increasingly we're working with land managers and farmers across sort of the northwest region, looking at different ways we can manage agricultural peat soils in a way that is good for the environment, but also can still provide that income for farmers in the area as well.
Let's start with the basics. What exactly is paludiculture, and why is it important?
Okay, so I guess I'll actually start with why it's important. So, for example, in our region in sort of northwest England, the patch we cover, Lancashire, Greater Manchester, North Merseyside, there was historically large areas of what we call lowland raised bog, or fen peat soils as well, and these peat soils are amazing in terms of the amount of carbon they can store and sequester in the long term when they're sort of waterlogged natural conditions, and also homes for amazing wildlife as well. But over the last few hundred years, a lot of the peat soils have been drained and converted for agriculture. There's sort of grade 1 agricultural land in our area, and also drained for, housing developments and all sorts of things. But a large amount of the peat soils in our area are now agricultural peat soils. There's really been this balance that we need to strike between still providing the incomes for the farmers and the farming communities in our area, but also realising that those peat soils, when they're drained and drying out, are not playing the vital role they could play for the environment and for climate mitigation, etc. So that's why they're so important. They're amazing places. Yeah, we need to find a way that they can be great places for environment, wildlife and people as well. And that's where paludiculture comes in, because as you mentioned in your introduction, paludiculture, we like to call it wetter farming. I think that's more says what it is on the tin, so to speak, than paludiculture, which is quite a unknown term. So that involves basically raising the water table sufficiently to then grow crops that thrive in sort of more wetter conditions. It maintains that agriculture in the area, but grows crops that can thrive in those wetter conditions.
I mean, a lot of our listeners, they may drive, if they're farmers, they may drive through the fens, say, look at this incredible grade one soil and look on it with great jealousy. But actually, as you're saying here, that landscape hasn't been like that forever, which I think is always important to remember, actually sort of seeing landscapes in context. But also, is this about sort of looking to the long term? Is this
Absolutely.
about sort of imagining that actually this isn't going to be the case forever? So how do we find some sort of middle ground?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the reality is that when you sort of drain and dry out the peat, that peat soil is oxidizing and it's being blown away when it's drying out. And so in terms of the long-term sustainability, the conventional farming that we see, the drainage-based farming we see in agricultural peat soil areas isn't going to be sustainable into the long term. Just with climate change, we're seeing more erratic weather patterns or prolonged drought periods and intense rainfall. And the farmers that we have been working with and talking to in our area, I think all of them know that at least, an area on their farm where they're finding it increasingly difficult to manage profitably. Maybe they can get on to sow crops, but then they can't get on to harvest them later on because the ground's too wet, or they're simply not able to graze it any longer for a large part of the year because it's too wet. So those areas, they're not currently profitable, and they're looking forward with climate change. We need to think about how we can farm some areas differently into the future so that farming can continue, but also we can use these areas to help with climate mitigation.
So, Jenny, can you give us some examples, maybe, of some of these areas that Sarah's been alluding to?
Absolutely. So we're basically looking at a lot of our kind of lower lying areas. Currently, a lot of the work is around looking at lowland peat soils, specifically with that kind of environmental message in mind. Currently, 3% of overall UK greenhouse gas emissions come just from drained lowland agricultural peat, which proportionally is just wildly out of proportion for the actual amount of land that covers. So we're talking about these areas that have been historically drained, but that actually we're not going to be able to carry on farming all of these on that kind of drainage based model that we're using at the moment. With some of the areas that we're working with sort of up in the northwest, we've worked out that there's probably no more than 80, 100 years left under current drainage based agriculture until actually all of that peat soil has gone. And then you're down to the sort of glacial clay underneath, which is certainly not going to be grade one agricultural land. So it is about looking to find a way that we can protect this soil and we can protect the carbon that's in it, but we can also protect that land so that it can be farmed into the future. So it's definitely tricky, and we're not saying that this is going to be a one size fits all, but it's about finding a way that it's going to work for the environment and for farmers at the same time.
It's worth noting as well, actually, that paludiculture, wetted farming, is not actually totally new. So if you think about the Norfolk Broads, there's been practices going back generations where there's traditions of managing and harvesting reed to provide thatch for housing. So that is wetted farming. So it's not a totally new concept that we're talking about here. It is something that has been done in the past and does take place elsewhere in other countries as well.
So you mentioned thatching as one example. In terms of cropping, in terms of outputs that we're thinking of when we're thinking of cropping these areas of land, what are the options? What are some of the innovations that people are actually doing?
So yeah, there's quite a few different options actually that are out there and that are being trialled at the moment. So up here on our patch, we've got one trial where we're looking at growing conventional food crops. So a lot of the lowland peat in our region is farmed for salads. So we're kind of trying to mirror that, but at a higher water table to see actually does it work? Is there a difference in yield? What do we need to do differently? That kind of thing. So we've got a trial and we've grown celery, we've got blueberries growing, we've grown lettuce. We're going to look at some other crops as well this year, things like maybe rhubarb. And then there's also a lot of work looking into kind of more like novel crops, one of which is sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss is essentially what makes peat. Like, it's the sort of keystone species of peatlands. But there is a market for growing sphagnum as a commercial crop. And basically what you do is you harvest that, it gets dried out, and it gets used to create growing media or compost. So obviously with the shift away from using peat in bagged compost, in horticulture and things like that, we're going to need to replace that with something. And sphagnum essentially is just peat before it's become peat. It has all those really great water holding qualities. So it makes fantastic peat-free growing media. So there's definitely quite a potentially quite big market there. Another crop that we're trialing is typha, or bulrushes, as we call them sort of locally. And there's a couple of uses for those. So we're working with a company called Ponder, who take, the fluffy seed heads, and they have developed a process that turns that into padding for filling for padded jackets. So instead of using either polyester or goose down, you can use bulrush, which is pretty cool. And then also there's a lot of work going on with the stalks and the leaves of the bulrushes. They can create a really good fibre board to be used in the building industry. We're also working with a research group who are looking at turning them into packaging for like takeaway food. And there's quite a lot of sort of other more like novel crops out there that could be used. So maybe, we're looking at some kind of combination of some food crops, perhaps some novel crops, and just seeing what's going to be best for different areas of land, what's going to, work out financially.
Whoever knew that you could do so much with a bulrush? I can almost hear
amazing.
any farmers out there who have some on their land thinking, there's money-making potential. Sarah, anything to add?
Well, no, I mean, you talk about that, farmers seeing that they might have bulrush typha growing on their land. It is, if you think about these peanut areas, they're going to be things that grow there already. So it's not necessarily to think about the novel crop. So yeah, bulrush typha is a great one that we see it growing in ditches and in areas of farmland anyway. So why not think about how you can utilize that and use it to generate income? One of the areas that excites me quite a lot, other than the typha and the sphagnum, is looking at what food can be grown at a high water table, what conventional food crops that we already grow on a drainage based way can be grown at a high water level. So I think, because there's a lot of concerns, or there have been concerns when we talk to farmers about what about food security. So we can't take a lot of the agricultural peat soils which are being used for food production out of food production. So we need to look at how we can make that work still. What are the differences in yields if you grow conventional food crops at a high water table? So this year we're going to be looking at, as Jenny mentioned, we've got blueberries. We're going to be looking at Chinese leaf this year and radishes, and we're looking at also crops that we've grown over winter to reduce the amount of bare peat soil. So we're probably looking at things like kale as well. So looking at those crops that already end up on our supermarket shelves, as opposed to novel crops. But it's going to be about looking at the landscape and looking at what grows best where, and it's not taking everything out of conventional production and putting it into wetted farming. It's looking at a mosaic of a landscape scale and adding another tool to the farming toolbox, I would say.
So is there much collaboration with people working together on this?
Lancashire Wildlife Trust as a whole, we're always very keen and see the need to work in partnership with people across the landscapes where we work, because I think that's where success comes, when you bring different people together to find out what the challenges are and find solutions together. So in terms of the environment and climate change and the role that the peat soils can play, so it's by talking to the farmers and the farming groups and other land managers in the area, finding out, okay, how are you managing your land currently? Where are the issues, what are the challenges you're facing, and how can we work together to find solutions. That's always been our approach. So from our first project where we had funding through it's actually EU funding to set up what we call our carbon farm. That was our first sort of step into wetter farming world. And that was growing essentially a permanent cover crop of sphagnum mosses. So we re-wet this area of land that we purchased and then used that to demonstrate what was possible to grow there and what the economics would be, the business model for it. And we used that to sort of engage different groups of people, bring on people from the NFU and other farmers in the area to say, what do you think about this? Could it work? What could we do differently? What would your thoughts on this be? What are the issues? And it's by having those conversations we've managed to then go on to trial other approaches to wetter farming, for example, growing conventional food crops, looking at TIFA. And so I think it's really important because by doing this, we can look at how different ways of managing land can help tackle environmental challenges we have and the climate change challenges we have, but also at the same time looking at the farming challenges there are there. For example, areas on farmland where they're too wet to manage productively and make a profit from, and what can we do differently in those areas, for example, that can tick all the boxes for environment, climate and farming. So I think collaboration is really key, and we've made some really good partnerships with farmers in the area through that. And so some of the trials we're working with the farmers, and they are the ones who are managing the trial sites and have done the groundwork to set up the trial area and have sown the crops and are managing it and managing the water levels, and we'll be doing the harvesting, and they're working with us, and we've set them a scrap heap challenge to adapt existing machinery to be able to harvest crops on these sort of high water table areas. So it's a really collaborative approach that we're going for, because at the end of the day, we're Lancashire Wildlife Trust, we're not farmers. So if we want to make this work, it has to work from a financial point of view for the farmers, and we need the expertise from all different areas.
Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, basically, we couldn't do this without the input of both the farmers that we're working with and also, other farmers that might just be coming along to the sites, coming to a visit, we're talking to at events, things like that. That input is just absolutely invaluable. As Sarah said, we came to this sort of from a conservation background and have realised, well, okay, clearly we cannot restore every area of peat in the entire of the UK back to pristine natural bog. It's just completely, that would be silly. It seems unfeasible. So let's find ways that we can kind of make this land work, both environmentally, but also for farmers, for the farming community. Like, I come from a farming family. No one goes into farming for all the money and the time off. You go into farming because you love to farm and, you're good at it. You know your land. Like, no one knows their land better than a farmer. So that's why we really, really need to kind of have those conversations, to work with people, to build those relationships. And yeah, I mean, as Sarah said, one of the big questions we've been asked quite correctly time and time again is like, how are you going to harvest this from a field with a higher water table? And for a while we were like, we don't really know. And now one of the farmers that we're working with in his amazing workshop is creating, well, she's known as Edna, our bulrush harvester, who was once an apple who was once an apple harvester, and is just getting scrap heap challenged away. But without that kind of expertise and without that knowledge, we'd be stuck. Yeah, so it's just incredibly important that we kind of build these relationships and can share that knowledge.
To what extent is this part of policymakers' thinking at the moment, and could we be in a position where wetter farming is part of landscape recovery schemes, SFI specific schemes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when I first came into sort of definitely peatland restoration and conservation, it felt as more a focus on sort of upland peatland. I guess because so much of the lowland areas have been sort of drained and converted for sort of quite, grade 1 agriculture. It wasn't really thought of as an area that things could be done differently, possibly. But I think increasingly policymakers are seeing that, obviously, in terms of the carbon emissions and reducing sort of UK carbon emissions and moving towards net zero, lowland agricultural peat areas have a really big role to play. So I think that is, from my feeling, I think that's switched to focus a bit, and lowland agricultural peat areas are sort of being thought of from a policy point of view about what different management options. And I think that's reflected in sort of some of the financial incentives that might come through sort of the changes in the ELMS scheme, and sort of some of the options for lowland peat in the sort of SFI schemes and things like that, where some of the options for raising the water level in cropped or arable peat soils, the payments per hectare are really quite good compared to what they used to be. So I think that's sort of demonstrating, I guess, the importance that policymakers are placing on our agricultural peat soil areas. But just going back to the previous point, I want to say that it doesn't have to be either or, sort of either farming or conservation. I think the two can sit side by side. So in a lot of areas where we are working, you might have your core conservation areas, which are managed purely for wildlife. That might be, sort of our nature reserves. And then surrounding that, you might have your wetter farming areas where you've got the high water table, but it's still farming it, but they allow more movement and corridors for wildlife to move throughout the landscape. And then you might still have your more sort of drainage-based conventional farming, with that wet farm providing a buffer between the core conservation and your conventional farming areas. So I think we really need to think about a mosaic which can work for wildlife and people.
Jenny, I'm interested in the conversations that you have with farmers on this when it comes to rewetting and the range of responses that you get.
It is a real range. One of the things we tend to get a lot of the time is like, wetter farming, the bloody land's wet enough. And that does sort of, make sense. A lot of people are really battling with sort of waterlogged land that's getting more and more difficult to farm. And so, they're kind of interested in finding out a bit more, like, oh, right, so I could potentially turn this land that's currently really hard work, that's really unprofitable, actually into something that might, I might be able to farm again, might be able to make me some money. At the end of the day, there's always going to be a scale, and it's not going to be right for everyone. Not everyone's going to want to investigate it. But what I've noticed, I'd say probably over the past few years, is that there's certainly more awareness of some of the issues, and that sort of wetter farming or paludiculture could potentially be something that could be used to kind of address some of these. So, we've been going to agricultural shows for a couple of years, and I remember standing on a stall that had a great big Paludiculture banner on the top of it, and a couple of years ago standing on that stall and people walking past going, Paludi, what?
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely, some people still, it's a completely new word, but that's going down. And actually there's more people being like, oh, I've heard of this, tell me more, explain it to me, how could this work on my land? And what is also really useful actually is people will come and talk and challenge, because those, challenging and asking questions is so important, and it's really, really useful. And that's how we figure out where the issues lie and how to try and work around those. And I think, as Sarah mentioned, there are some of the new payment schemes that have been announced in SFI. Obviously, that's paused at the moment, which is a different it's a conversation for a different day. But, some of those payments are really good. And once you start being able to give people some kind of ideas of whether or not you can make any money out of this, then that really helps to move that conversation on as well. So a lot of the work we've been doing has been kind of sitting almost in the background, Because as a wildlife trust, one of the things we are able to do is sort of sit in a bit of a bridge in between farmers and policymakers. So as much as we work with farmers, we're on first name terms with a lot of the people in DEFRA, because a lot of the work we're doing and, the monitoring, the data we're getting out of that, we're feeding directly to those policymakers. We're bringing DEFRA out onto the sites. We're bringing, ministers and people out onto some of our sites to say, look, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. We need you to know about this. Here are some of the issues. What can you do to help address these or support it? Having those conversations is really important. But yeah, absolutely. We still have quite a lot of conversations with people being like, are you mad? My fields are already extremely wet. Why would I want to make them wetter?
I think there is also, although yes, the northwest is renowned for the amount of rainfall we get compared to the east of England. So the challenges for future wetter farmers will be different in the northwest and the east of England. But we're all going to be facing that changing climate where the weather patterns are more unpredictable. So you might have prolonged dry periods, even as well as those sort of intense rainfall periods as well. And that's what we hear a lot from farmers, like wanting to think about how they can manage water differently. So you might need to think about water storage for some parts of the year. When it is, you are having that intense rainfall in order to be able to deal with the prolonged dry periods as well. But each region has its own challenges. For example, the northwest, especially where we're working, we don't have internal drainage boards, but obviously they exist in other parts of the country. So that poses different opportunities and challenges for each region. But I imagine we face a lot of the same questions. So which have been very valid questions when we've brought people out to our trial sites. So, how will I not flood my neighbour's land? That was one of the key things. So trying to demonstrate what we've done in terms of ground preparation in order to be able to prevent any sort of flooding on neighbour's land. And then we had the question about, but what about food security? So that's why in another of our trials, we said, okay, let's look at what food crops can be grown. So those conversations, even if they're challenging ones, are really good. But the bottom line will be demonstrating the financial opportunities for wetter farming if we really want it to be scaled up and rolled out further. And that will come through both support through, for example, DEFRA and environmental stewardship payments, but also demonstrating how this can fit within sort of green finance, blended finance options through carbon.
A fascinating conversation today. I'm sure that listeners will have many other questions going through their minds. If a farmer or landowner or anyone else for that matter is listening to this and is interested in wetter farming, where can they go to find out more information or support? Is there anything you can signpost them to?
One of the great places you can go to is just our website. So that's lancswt.org.uk. You can email us as well, which is just info@lancswt.org.uk. There's also another really nice website called Paludiculture.org.uk. That's got details of like all the different trials, all the different sort of organisations who are involved, and contact details on there as well. And yeah, basically, we're always really happy to talk. We're always really keen to talk to people, to answer questions, to be challenged. And so yeah, get in touch, give us a shout. We'd love to hear from you.
Brilliant. Well, we will leave it there. But Jenny and Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a new subject for me, and a new subject, I'm sure, for many of our listeners. So it will have got brains thinking for sure. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having us on too.
That is it for today. We will leave it there. A big thank you to my guests, Jenny Bennion and Sarah Johnson, for coming on the show. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you can join me next time. But for now, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers. And thank you very much for listening.